All right, hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today, we have with us Dr. Andrew Flory, who is the Head of Department for Philosophy SL and Head of Academic Services for Pamoja Education. Originally from the UK, he now lives in Oxford. He has an English Literature degree from the University of Sheffield and a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of East Anglia, Norwich, and a PhD in Literature from Essex University. Andrew has been teaching since 1982 and has been teaching the IB since 1987, including IB English and Theory of Knowledge. He has also served as a school administrator in independent, maintained, and international schools in the UK, Norway, and Singapore. In 2002, he began work as a subject area manager in the Diploma languages section of the International Baccalaureate in Cardiff. In February 2010, he was appointed as the curriculum area head of the IB Diploma languages section. With that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Justin. That's great. And thanks to the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute for giving us this opportunity. We're a small group, so please chip in with questions whenever you want. That's the important thing, I think, rather than waiting for me to continue a long spiel and feeling you then have to write your questions down and bring them in at the end. I think I'll start by just telling everybody a little bit about Pamoja Education. Unless you're directly involved with the IB Diploma and Diploma program online, you may not know much about it. We are, as you'll see in the final slide, the only approved provider of online diploma program courses for the IB, and we currently offer 17 courses and are moving to offer some of the core subjects such as theory of knowledge and the extended essay. The reason we exist is really about access, about allowing as many students as possible to access the International Baccalaureate Diploma program in situations where perhaps their school is unable to provide certain subjects, where it's difficult to bring together students in a bricks and mortar school to manage certain and take certain subjects. But as well as that, one thing that's become very apparent to all of us is that doing things online is not just instrumental. There's very clearly a value in and of itself in working online, and that's something that's made working for Pamoja Education very exciting. And it's exciting also because it links strongly to the IB mission and to the learner profile. And I think those of you that know the learner profile of the IB recognize how attractive it is. And I think one of the things online learning conducted in the way Pamoja Education does it is it models a lot of the learner profile attributes. And that's something that I find really exciting. Now, the specific area I want to look at today is a piece of research done for Pamoja by the Institute of Education, part of the University of London, that deals essentially with research into education and also trains teachers. And this looked at the question we've asked ourselves from the start, really is, does what we do and the way we do it support students at university above and beyond just gathering good knowledge about their subject and being successful about their subject. And this research was conducted between February and July last year, 2014. It involved, first of all, a literature review, which I'll speak about briefly in the next slide, followed by a student self-report survey with 108 university students, and 58 of those students had studied at least one course of their IB diploma with Pamoja Education. So there's a comparison there. There's also students who didn't study online, who have different understandings and different ways of managing their diploma, which makes the study a bit richer perhaps than it would have been otherwise. It then interviewed 7 teachers with a researcher. That was particularly interesting too, because I think one of the things one forgets is how radically online learning methodologies changes the teacher's role, and that's something I want to talk about a little later. But to turn to the next slide, you can see that the literature review, which was comprehensive, but of course online learning is very new. There is very little online learning of the type Pamoja Education conducts, where it includes a teacher and a class, as it were. So nonetheless, it's growing, and it's still seen as rudimentary. That's not to as it were, make a judgment about it, but it's obviously online learning tends to be more about accessing resources, doing research online, rather than a more fully established way of teaching a whole course. But there's a lot of evidence that experience of technology within learning at school help with the transition to university, and I think the research tried to look at whether that was simply the fact that you do things in school that you're going to do at university and using learning management systems and different ways of communicating, but also whether the experience of technology had an impact on the way you learned, and whether that way of learning, the development of greater independence and autonomy as a learner, equipped you more fully and more effectively to learn at university. Also, following on from this, it was very clear that being able to use technology appropriately is relevant to jobs and wider life. And of course, there are very few places now where you could walk into a job and not be expected to manage some of your communication, some of your work through online and technological means. Moving on though, the interesting thing is, for me as a teacher, the last 2 pieces in a way, the self-regulation that's developed through online learning and the intercultural communication. And self-regulation, which sounds a bit puritanical in many ways, but is actually really about students becoming more autonomous. It's very connected to approaches to teaching and learning, and those of you that know the IB will know it's taken what I think is a very brave decision to integrate approaches to teaching and learning, ATL, into all its diploma courses. And those of you that are using the IB in schools or know it well will have noticed, as subjects are being reviewed and new subject guides are coming out, these kind of ATL aspects, self-regulation, reflection, greater student autonomy, are being brought in. And I say this is a brave move because, of course, one of the themes of this research is, in a sense, and again you go to the learner profile, in a sense there are some risks here. We're not making sure that the students are coddled into a successful achievement of a grade. It's much more about sharing with the students the process of learning, and that creates a changing landscape for both the teacher and the student. The other thing, which I think is an interesting point, is the whole issue of intercultural communication. I've worked a lot in international schools, and one of the things I loved about it was being in a classroom with students who came from across the world. But of course, in many ways, what dominated was the culture of the school. And that was right and proper. The schools are very rich places. One of the great things they do is share their own culture with their students. But one of the things that is absolutely fascinating about the kind of global classroom that you experience in Pamoja Education is that the students are in your classroom with their different cultures, but they join that classroom from the location of their existing culture. So you may be doing a business management class. You may have students from Northern Europe who are used to economies and ways of doing business that are very strongly linked to the state and the way the state manages regulation and both a kind of social contract. Think of countries like Scandinavia, for instance. And then you might also have students who are working out of places like Hong Kong and Singapore, where there might be a much greater sense of a different business culture, a different way of working. And I remember one teacher saying just how fascinating it was to share that experience with the students. So that was particularly interesting. So three key things I think emerging are the importance of students' familiarity with technology, using technology offline and online as a way of facilitating their work and their experience of education, but the way it also facilitates their independence and autonomy, their ways of becoming more familiar with the kind of approaches to teaching and learning methodologies that we believe are so rich and so important, and also intercultural communication and understanding the fact that you're working with people who come from communities and have experiences that you may never have shared. And we've had some really honest and interesting material from students talking about what it was like to come from one particular place where they were very embedded in that culture, as we all are, and to share a very different way of working with others. So looking at the perspective then, that the survey found a number of things, and a number of things here that students looking back, and some of them, remember these students when they were surveyed were at university now, so they're looking with the benefit of hindsight to what they learnt. And I particularly like the sense that the IB learning, the online learning, was a rehearsal space to develop approaches to study, that students were able to take ownership of their studying. And you can see here their experience in a range of online learning tools they're now using. A lot of students go straight into learning management systems at university, which if they've been in a school without that, they may be totally unfamiliar with. And interesting too that students did clearly work in different ways, using fewer print resources, using the internet for research, perhaps potentially being more nimble researchers. Interestingly too, valuing note-taking yet less, which I found interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive, that either they're aware that note-taking is maybe ritualistic and doesn't always contribute what you hope it will, but also perhaps that they were able to access resources more easily, just as I hope none of you are taking notes, but may well go back to the slides or back to the recording of this as something you want to listen to again or share. Perhaps it emphasizes that kind of understanding. And again, I like the quote at the bottom, this sense of, if you like, relishing unfamiliarity and being excited by the fact that they're doing things in a different way. And one of the things the research stressed a great deal actually was that students were setting out to do things with which they were unfamiliar, that they were forced to be risk takers, to turn to the learner profile again in the way they undertook their education, and that this gave them an opportunity to do that in a relatively safe environment, in a very carefully modelled and protected environment. So we look then at a summary of this, that almost all the students surveyed felt that the whole idea of using technology was an important preparation for university. And this included things like finding academic resources. A particularly important thing was coordinating group work through things like Google Hangouts to conferencing tools that enabled them to do discussion or group work in a key way. Puts many students ahead. It's not so difficult sometimes to quickly set up a group online and manage a group Skype call. It might be much more difficult to arrange for everybody to meet in a physical space. A lot of their studies are conducted online. They're accessing support materials. They're able to at times share documents through things like Google Docs, and of course they can submit their work. So this keys into another thing I think is very important too, that is crucial to the experience students get from online learning, is a sense of collaboration. And collaboration, we feel really strongly, both between our teachers and between students, is a crucial part of the online learning experience and learning generally, which really enables students to leverage a whole range of extra resources from each other. And I think one of the key things to remember about the online environment is, as well as the things like being able to access materials differently, using technology to allow for rapid and effective research and things like that, you also are in a situation where you're forced to work with others. You're forced to leverage your technology to enable others to work with you and to support you in preparing for what you're doing. So I think that collaborative piece is really important and something that we will look at as we go further. Again, a slide really which is just two quotes about how students learned more effectively through online mediums. Getting through group projects without the benefit of face-to-face meetings. That does sound slightly interesting, but obviously what it's really talking about is the fact that the sheer challenge of setting up face-to-face meetings in a busy schedule. And I also like particularly the idea of the student allocating time to finish subjects that they're currently taking and scheduling their own time. We forget how much we protect students from the ability to manage their own learning. The face-to-face classroom is dominated by the whole issue of lessons that finish at a particular time. Well, one of the great things about the online environment is there are no bells or sirens, whatever decides the end of the lesson. So there's a greater sense of continuity, a sense that work's done at a time when students are able to do it, want to do it, where they can, take the opportunity when it comes rather than having to wait for that. And that's one of the really important things I feel about that. If we move on now to the teacher's perspective, now, as I said, the position of the teacher in relation to the student changes an awful lot in online learning, and particularly in the online learning where you have a classroom, and well, not a classroom exactly, you have a class, you have a teaching section. So the teachers are still linked to students. There's no sense that this is like a MOOC or a very distant operation. In fact, there's a great deal of interaction, and I think one of the dances that teachers have to do, if you like, in managing the online classroom is getting the whole issue of contact and support right, against this attempt to support students becoming more autonomous learners. But that greater move to student autonomy is not in any way an abrogation of the teacher's responsibility. It's all about working with the students so that they will be able to learn that, to give them the support they need to develop that independence, rather than just letting them in and saying, okay guys, you're on your own. It's not at all like that. All our teachers are highly experienced as classroom teachers in the IB and other awards. And this interesting comment from one of our teachers about the class having a personality and the way the individual can get lost in that. I think that is a fascinating and an important point, which speaks to the whole issue of the dynamics of the online classroom. And this comment came from a larger discussion where the teacher talked about the way that the face-to-face classroom has a real element of cut and thrust in it. Pecking orders do develop. Teachers are very skillful in undermining these, but we have to be honest with ourselves. The dynamic and the relationships that build within the classroom are not entirely ours to control, because so many of them come from outside the classroom. And students do get lost. I think one teacher said, discussion in a classroom can be really quick and fast, and often the teacher tends to take over and dominate in order to control it. With the online forums, when they're working well, students have more time. Quiet ones can contribute and get their voice heard. And I just know by looking at the forums, some of the best forum contributors wouldn't stand a chance in a face-to-face classroom. And that's a really interesting point, I think. The fact that the online environment doesn't rely on a kind of fighting for precedence. Much of the communication is asynchronous, and students can undertake that in their own time, contributing in writing to a discussion forum. And the fact you're continuing to contribute in writing as well as through audio means is important too, because I remember when I was doing my MA once, a researcher saying to me, who was looking at oral work with students, oral work is great, but it's like writing on water, that so much is lost. And one of the things that I enjoyed when I came to the online environment was seeing the way students develop their communication through written means. Now, moving to the teacher, I think moving further into the teacher's experience, these comments about teachers being facilitators are of great interest, I think, because many teachers find moving into an online environment very strange. One of our best teachers, I remember, said when he first began teaching online, he felt he'd lost his voice. His sense of being the person who had understanding and control over the process was suddenly lost, and he found that initially, critically undermining. And when he came through that, and this was in the training, not in his teaching, he proved to be one of our best teachers, and I think really relished the fact that there was no longer the pressure on him to be the leader. And I think teachers often find this experience very empowering, and paradoxically it's because teachers lose power in an online classroom. There's no doubt about it that the shift in the way things are undertaken in the online classroom does change the power relationship. It's no longer so pyramidal, it's much flatter. The teacher is much more likely to adopt a position as a fellow learner rather than as a figure of authority. And many teachers relish that, and many teachers relish what they learn from students, and particularly in allowing students to develop their own ways of working together. And teachers also watch how students develop as they progress. And again, this comes back to what I was talking about, that there is not an expectation that students at 16 walk into the diploma program classroom ready and willing and able to be autonomous learners. That's a process that has to be learned, has to be scaffolded, they have to be given appropriate support. But they do develop that, and that means the teacher has to adjust the way they work with them. And you'll see this phrase, skillful neglect. Skillful neglect is a phrase, I think, that was coined by Bev Labette, a researcher at the University of East Anglia in the UK, and he used it way back in the 80s when computers minus the internet were first brought into schools. And one of the things he was looking at was the way perhaps the teacher's greatest skill is knowing when to step back and make space for students, knowing when to neglect to intervene as a teacher in order to allow learning to proceed. And I think at the most basic level, all of us know when we've had students in groups, for instance, and we've gone round and we've intervened to make a comment, no matter how encouraging, and suddenly it's as if the wheel has stopped, the group stops talking. And I see Catherine's put through a question there which ties into this. Yeah, that's a very good point, and a very counterintuitive one, I think, as well, because one of the things that teachers and students often fear, and I assume you can all see Catherine's comment about, do teachers get a lot of one-on-one time? It is a challenge, of course, because obviously in terms of sustainability and scalability, if you've got 25 students in a class, you've got to manage the one-on-one time very carefully. But what certainly is true is that the majority of your interactions with students are one-on-one. Now, they might be through emails, through chat, through a whole variety of different communication means, but they also will be through Skype contact. One of the things, for instance, or a similar conference call, one of the things that one of our teachers said in the survey, which I think is very interesting about building that relationship. There's a whole section of this in the research was the teacher said right from the beginning I tried to talk to my students on Skype because knowing there's a person behind a computer makes a big difference. And I think this is really important. The teachers do find it really exciting, actually. And you know, the face-to-face classroom, and we're not competing with face-to-face, and I don't want to make a specious comparison, but I certainly know from my own experience that when as a teacher you've also got the job to mediate content, which you don't have in the same way in the online environment, because the classroom is flipped. And to use Khan's phrase, the students are accessing the content themselves and doing that, if you like, when they're normally doing homework. And the teacher intervenes very much at the point of learning need when they're working with the content. So you've got a very rich environment there, and that's where there's a lot of one-on-one contact. Sometimes it might be through what we call live lessons, where teachers run a roster where they offer live lessons every couple of weeks on a particular topic, but often it will be through a Skype call where a student just needs to talk over something or just needs some direct help. Sometimes it will be through a range of different ways of communicating through email and chat, as I said before. And that whole issue of contact doesn't always go as well, however. It is a challenge in the sense that some students are very nervous and want constant endorsement about what they're doing. And we have to acknowledge that and recognize that, but try and work with them also to make sure that they're able to move forward and not use contact as a crutch, but as a means of supporting their learning. So that is one thing we're very preoccupied, and one thing that is very rich, and certainly something that is the big dynamic that the teacher has to master. So moving on, there's, as you'll see, some quotes from the research about how students do communicate. And these I find very encouraging, really, and students do work like this. And don't forget that the other thing, just as there are no bells in the classroom, there are no clocks in the same way, and you'll have, say, in an economics department, 6 teachers. Now, all of those teachers, when they're online, there's a green button beside their name in the class list, and every teacher's in every class. So a student who, for instance, is in China and whose teacher is in Dubai, and let's say that the teacher in Dubai is not up yet, and the student in China is, because he's 4 hours ahead and he's working on his Pamoja work, and he's got a question, he can ask another teacher who maybe is in the same time zone as him, and just quickly get some help. And that is something we're developing to a much greater extent through the use of learning spaces, where students will be in a teaching section in a class with the teacher of record, but they will also be in a learning space where they'll be able to communicate with other teachers in other classes, and teachers will be able to form groups across classes depending on students' interests in particular, in particular ways of working, particular topics, things like that. It may be, for instance, that you want to put a group of students together in economics or business management or psychology who come from very different cultural areas, and they want to share those cultural differences about the way things work, and something I've seen work really well. These are some statistics from the research about students, and I think this is again about what they're doing, what they find useful. Remember, this is students at university talking about what has been useful coming into university. I think also it really looks at the fact that there's an opportunity for students, I think, as somebody said, to fail well and fail early in their education, to get a sense of being in a safe space, as we mentioned before, where they can try things out. I think online particularly facilitates that. It's a naturally experimental space for all sorts of reasons, and students get used to working in that way. I think also one thing that is again about communication and collaboration in the online space. It's a surprisingly rich and nuanced place in which to communicate. Many people fear potential anonymity and isolation in the online environment, but strangely enough, the opposite seems to be true. And particularly in the Pamoja environment, you've got a completely transparent environment. Our interactions are recorded, they're visible, they're available. We can go back and look over them. We can conduct a live lesson with 5 students who were in the right time zone to access it at that time. And then all the students in the class can listen to the recording, can then come back and talk about it in a discussion forum. And you can see the last point here, the last 2 points about building relationships with other learners and being able to use wikis and online editing tools to create shared materials is valuable. Group work is a challenge. It is a challenge because supporting students to manage group work across time zones, to take on that sense of responsibility, they require a great deal of support to do it. But when it does work, it works really well, and it's one of the strongest aspects we can manage. So looking at the teacher's point of view and the ways in which they felt studying online contributed to their readiness for university. Again, you come in to the 3 themes we really looked at: the idea of the student's independence, their familiarity with technology, and their ability to experience intercultural communication. A very nice idea here. You've got the idea that students take responsibility for their learning choices. The actual choice to study online is always an important one. Students are rarely in a position where they're just dropped into this. And the fact that they choose to study something is going to be a challenge that they're not going to have immediate familiarity with and be able to, if you like, rely on things that they already do and already know how to do. And I think that courage is really important. They do experience learning approaches used at university. More and more universities, certainly in the UK, with which I'm familiar, are using LMSs, are doing an awful lot of material online, including apparently getting rid of the dissection room for medical students to a large extent, because so much of it is done virtually now, which was an interesting look at that. A friend of mine was talking about whose daughter is studying medicine. The point about giving learners responsibility for selecting the technologies, I think, is a really nice one, because we forget that there are many different ways of managing communication and collaboration online, that it might be through chat, and it might be through email, it might be through Google Hangouts or a conferencing tool like the big blue button that we use in Pamoja now. All these things serve different purposes, and students get the experience of understanding the appropriate purpose for that, and that creates a very effective way of allowing them to work with others. And again, this stress about low-risk challenges. Students can learn from the experience. You can try things out. You can try a group project. It didn't work because you weren't prepared enough, because you hadn't thought about the different time zones you were in. You hadn't thought about dividing up the work properly. Next time you do it better. But also you've got material you can go back to look at and think about in that. So that really is what teachers thought about it. As I said, teachers find it exciting, they find it challenging, they find it really interesting to find themselves in a different structure, and a structure that includes a different power relationship. And I don't mean that the power relationship is malign in any way. I just use it purely descriptively, in that the teacher is calling the shots in most classrooms. It's important that they do. They've got responsibility for the students. Online, you can, as I said, create a flatter structure. Students have more opportunity to take control of the learning process and of their place in it, which is very important. And it finishes up with Pamoja's little blurb, which is terribly text heavy, and I'm sure you can read that later at your leisure. The only thing I would add to this really is something I said at the start, that we're trying to model these ideas in the way we teach and use the IB. We're extremely lucky to be involved in the IB, which has a mission we are committed to, but also has exciting ways of working and exciting principles to which it holds. But I've talked enough, and I hope that's had some clarity for you, but I hope also you've got questions or challenges or concerns you might want to raise. So I don't know whether Justin's able to give people the mic, or whether it's better to do this through the chat. I'm quite happy however we choose to do it.
Sure. Yep. So it looks like Catherine's typing up something there. If any of our participants have any questions, please just go ahead and submit them through the chat. Or if you do want to participate via mic, just let me know that through the chat, and I can enable your mic as well if you'd like to talk a little bit more at length with Andrew about something that he talked about during the presentation.
It's a pleasure, Catherine. It's a pleasure. It's a great opportunity. We don't have a further formal research program in which we're participating. What we do have is an ongoing program evaluation linked to Columbia University, who we work closely. We employ one of their researchers as part of the university to actually support us in program evaluation. And this is something that it's, yes, with Susan Lowe's, yeah. And this has been very exciting because we've, if you like, ramped that up quite significantly recently, because we've been doing a number of new things, and in particular we're moving into a new way of teaching and learning using learning spaces rather than the conventional teaching section. So we're very keen to find out how that affects teaching and learning in Pamoja Education, whether what we believe and hope it will do does actually happen. So program evaluation, people are all involved in it. That's one of the most powerful things, and they all have access to the results. And I think that creates a very reflective community, if it works well, where people are thinking about their work not just in terms of getting the job done, but thinking about how it speaks to a kind of action research agenda, if you like. And certainly one of the things I'd like to do as head of academic services is develop a kind of very much research-led atmosphere in the school, where people are looking not just at, you know, as I said, getting the job done, but looking at ways in which they can improve that, ways in which they can record and think about what's happening. I see there's some typing going on, so I'll wait for a second. Any pressing research areas, topics you haven't approached yet? I'll deal with Catherine's question first, and that's a really good question, because as I said, there ought to be topics that we're thinking about all the while. I suppose the biggest ones are getting more input from students. I think, like all education communities, ironically, the student gets asked last about how they find things and about what they're doing. We're trying to look to finding ways in which students can be more directly involved, for instance, in actually developing the courses which they study, whether we do that through students who've been through part of the course, then doing almost, if you like, internships with the course development and instructional design sections, so that can be shared. I'm also particularly interested personally in the areas of skillful neglect and doing more to create an environment where the teacher is a partner in the process rather than the main lever, if you like, of learning and education for students. Those are areas that I think we should. Otherwise, I think, this is where I'd want to go back to colleagues, particularly people like John Willoughby, the faculty advisor for Pamoja Education, who and manages the training and professional development, and so is constantly thinking about research topics. And I'd like to maybe share your question with him. It's one we should have at the top of our discussion board, really. Yeah, and your question is a very good one, because I think it speaks to the particular nature of TOK. Theory of knowledge, those of you who are not familiar with the IB, and I'll assume there might be some who aren't, is one of what's called the core courses in the diploma, which is one of three elements: community action and social service, and the extended essay that all students have to do. And TOK asks students to look critically at the knowledge they are gaining in their other subjects. So again, it's a very brave thing to do, because you're asking students to challenge you, and I've seen that happen in an interesting way in science, for instance, when a student did an experiment and got the results, and the teacher said, well, look, those results are no good, you better use mine. And the teacher had just come out of a TOK lesson on science as a way of knowing, and said, well, nobody told me that this class was conducted on an authority basis as opposed to an empiricism one, which did rather stop the poor teacher in their tracks. But to get to your question, I think it will actually. I think because TOK is a challenge for teachers. Remember that TOK goes across a whole range of ways of knowing in subject terms, and smaller schools, newly authorised schools, may not have the full range of subjects with the teachers able to do that. And furthermore, TOK is, apart from a few workshops the IB runs, nobody trains you to teach TOK. And in a sense, you want to access a kind of collective resource. This is an area where, if you can, you want to go outside your school so that students have access to, different ways of looking at their own learning. And that helps with this thing, concurrency of learning. TOK wants to get students to look across their subjects to understand what in their maths studies speaks to how they understand music, for instance, if they're doing it, and how it's different from different ways of learning. So yeah, I feel it will be something that people come up with for two reasons. One, it will solve a problem. It's very hard to get TOK taught successfully. Ideally, every teacher is a TOK teacher, but it would be naive to pretend that just because you're alert to the critical challenges in your own subject, you can then turn that into TOK material that students can work with. And we've got a lot of interest in that, interestingly enough, from schools that don't necessarily work with us already. And I think that's really interesting, because that's what you want. You want a big mix. You want people who are coming into doing the online DP in different ways and taking different pieces from it, so that you get a broader community building. Catherine's obviously typing, but Cindy, Erin, Jackie, names I don't recognise. It'd be really nice to see if you've got any questions or things you're interested. Yeah, Catherine, I think that would be great. I think this is a great forum for people to work in, and that's something I'd love to carry back to the office. I think we are trying, as I said, to create a more action research-based environment, and that is something I think people would relish and like to share. We've, we do have material, and it's also a way I'd like to involve students too. We've just had some students produce some material for a journal directed at students, the IB Review, edited by John Sprague, who's I think about to move to Singapore. So that's a very good question, and one I will follow up. So I'll try and get your email after this so I can keep you in touch with that. That's an interesting question. I mean, the one thing I was quite excited about this webinar was, as I spoke to Justin before, assuming that there would be a largely US audience, and because of the location, and also that made me think about the fact that there's a great deal of online education going on in the States, and a lot of the really interesting discussions I've had with people who are not teaching the IB or even know much about it, but have been teaching other subjects and doing other work online in the US, and particularly have a very good grasp of the difference between a student's experience online and a student's experience in a face-to-face classroom. Other countries, you see less. I don't know of any other countries that are doing the kind of thing Pamoja's doing, or the kind of things that people like Florida Virtual High School are doing, Florida Virtual School rather, are doing, or the Virtual High School. You do get it used instrumentally in places like Finland, where interesting that this was where the idea of doing an IB online was first trialed, and that's simply to do with the isolation of certain communities and certain students. But that wasn't much about an online methodology so much as simply using online as a delivery system. And Catherine's coming in there. Yeah, that would have been interesting. Yes, and Justin mentioned about the New Zealand network, which I'll be interested. I mean, these are people really we should reach out to, and of course you then got the organisations like EF, the Swedish Language School, and of course the MOOCs. All these organisations, so the MOOCs are largely based in the US, of course. You've got a lot in Canada, in Scandinavia, but again, that tends to be either post school. There's a business school in Scandinavia that works online in Norway, and those are the only things I know about, and that's Justin's. Yeah, we were able to do this. We've locked in a slight concern with the IB, because the IB, because our students don't do the full diploma online, the IB has to work very hard with schools and parents to allow separate release of results, a separate release to us and a separate release to the school, and then bringing the two together. And we're still working on finding a way to do that manages data privacy across so many jurisdictions, because one of our classes might have students from 14 countries in it. I think we teach students from over 100 countries at the moment, and it's been quite difficult to manage that. When we have had full sets of results, we have been able to compare students face-to-face results with their online results, And that's really helpful, but also comparing the whole cohort of online students and the average they achieve with world averages with the IB through the statistical bulletin they produce would be really interesting. And that's, maybe going back to Catherine's point, a research opportunity we ought to try and achieve once we manage to solve this data privacy piece on sharing results with the IB from individual students as opposed to the group as a whole. Any further questions? Any further questions or concerns or challenges to what I've been saying? Thanks, Anne. Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Well, thanks very much, everybody. I'll put my email in the box here in case anybody suddenly has a question they think of. And Catherine, if you can drop me a line on the question about research opportunities, that would be good as well. Okay. Justin, I think that looks like an appropriate place to finish. And that's great. Thank you, Anne. That's a really good thing to know. I think you sent that through in Pamoja earlier, and I think I've had a look at that. That's great. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Andrew. That was a very informative presentation, and we really appreciate getting a lot of great insight on a program that I think a lot of folks are unfamiliar with. So we really appreciate you shedding some light on a lot of those details. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your help, Justin. It's been great.
Of course. So before we wrap up, we just wanted to point our attendees to a couple of ongoing initiatives here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. We have a podcast series called Virtual Viewpoints, where we sit down with folks who are involved in the area of digital learning. And we get their perspectives on how they use research in their own work and how that research is helping them drive their work and drive our field as a whole forward. So you can click on that link there to see all of our previously recorded episodes and listen to them. And if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, feel free to drop me a line. I will add my email address as well if you'd like to share some insights about your own work. We also have a guest blogger program where you can see some folks who have written blog posts for us, and if you're interested in being a guest blogger for us, you can check out the details of that initiative by clicking that link there as well. And we do have an upcoming webinar, and that will be on June 16th. We'll be hearing from Wendy Drexler over at ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education, on the personal learning environments in K-12 online learning. That will be the 16th, which is a Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, so we encourage you to join us for that presentation as well. In the meantime, you can contact us by reaching out to us via email, mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link there. We send out, currently we send out a weekly reminder for our webinars and our other products that we've put out, and we are working on a monthly newsletter as well to keep you more in tune with the field as a whole, not just our own work here at MVLRI. We have our Facebook and Twitter handles listed there, as well as our LinkedIn page, our YouTube channel, where you can find the recordings of all of our prior webinars, and we'll be working to get the recording of this webinar up on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. So if you found today's presentation informative, we really encourage you to share the recording with some of your own colleagues and your audiences who would get some value out of it. You can check out our webinars page at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars to see all of our upcoming scheduled webinars, as well as the archives of all of our older webinars, where you'll see archived chats, the recording links, and other resources that went along with those webinars. Thank you again, Andrew. We really appreciate you taking the time to present today. Thank you to our presenters. We really appreciate you coming out and listening and participating. We hope everyone enjoys the rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks very much, Justin. Bye.